Thanks for coming today. My name's Cecilia Pascali. I'm the Unit Manager of Governance and Regulation in the Reform team here at DIPTI. I presented at the last workshop, so you probably, if you watched that one, or if you were here, you'll probably remember. I'm here today, obviously, for the second iteration of our, intended interaction with you guys about what we want to do in implementing this accredited professional scheme. And I'm here obviously to learn as much from what you have to say as anyone else in DIPTI wants to. We definitely are really keen to hear your feedback, and that's the purpose of today, is to sort of present on a few details that we've worked out on the scheme, and to work out what it is that you have to say about it, if you've thought of anything that we haven't, and more importantly, if you've thought of something smarter than we have. I'll get started. I just have to get through a few introductory things to begin with. Firstly, Sally Jenkin, who was tipped to be presenting today as well, couldn't make it in the end, so she sends her apologies. But I'm here with members of the team at DIPTI in the reform program here. There's one on every table, I think, so we're well supported. Penny is also running the show with the roving mic, and will also be presenting our questions that are put forward on live stream, which I'll address in a second. So we do have a very supportive team here happening, despite the fact that there's been a small change in the presentation. I will also take this opportunity to acknowledge that we're meeting today on the traditional land of the Kaurna people. We acknowledge them as the traditional custodians of the Adelaide region, and we respect their spiritual relationship with the country. So just getting through the next bit of things is the housekeeping, which is a bit boring, so bear with me. Firstly, the structure of today, as you saw from the email that would have gone out, is that the first part of today is effectively a presentation on what we want to discuss with you and the parts of the scheme that we think are relevant to today's discussion. We then move into a Q&A session where we get to hear your questions and answer them as far as we possibly can, and also take those comments on board as far as possible. We'll have a short break then of about 10 minutes, and then we come back and we have a bit of a workshop scenario where we ask the questions and we get you guys to brainstorm your responses, and we keep those because we think that they're very important to us. So that's the way that today will work, time frame wise. At the same time, I have to tell you about emergency evacuation and all those boring things. If you hear the sounds, just basically listen to all instructions carefully, and don't use elevators, obviously, unless you're directed to do so. There are bathrooms here for anyone that needs to use them. You might need to get a swipey card, but there's people on hand to give them to you if you need them. And also, if you don't mind, just make sure your phones are on silent or turned off so that we're not disturbed, because it will come through the live stream as well. Which brings me to the live stream part of today. Everyone who is watching us online, welcome. I haven't forgotten about you, don't worry. I just wanted to point out a few of the interactive features like I did last time. If you weren't using it, just in case you need an update or you just need a refresher. Effectively on the bottom left-hand side of your screen, you can submit your questions. I'm pointing to it. Hopefully it will come up on the screen. It will come up for you anytime throughout this session. For the whole workshop period, you can submit your questions and Penny will receive them. We'll moderate them as best as we can, and hopefully they're not coming in too fast and thick, but I think we should be able to manage it. We should also have links and instructions on the live stream link that you've been sent, so you should be able to interact with that all fairly well. But at the same time, if there's any troubleshooting or if there's IT problems, just let us know that as well through that function. I think that's probably it for the introductory stuff, so hopefully that wasn't too difficult. Some was important, some was less important, but I had to go through it all. So I guess I'll turn straight to the presentation for the day. thank you all for being here to begin with, because I do realise that this is not as exciting as the first workshop that we had, in that we're not presenting on the whole scheme today. The main components of today's discussion are intended to cover the intended CPD and education program that we want to implement for each level of accreditation and in each area of accreditation, and also touch on what we think a good transition period or transition requirements should be to get us from what currently exists under the Development Act requirements into what will exist under the PDNI Act requirements once this scheme is implemented, because we want that to transition as smoothly as possible and, to be quite honest, not interrupt the flow of work in the industry, because that would be probably more frustrating. So I'll get started on the slides. Effectively, the reason why we think that education is important is because we've sort of structured it as a requirement of the scheme, both for risk and benefit purposes. The first factor in the requirements that we see is this need for education in an ongoing sense through the lifespan of someone's accreditation and someone's career as a decision-making person under the Act. As we've said, the education requirements as a CPD, continuing professional development requirement, may include core competencies. I personally would say should include core competencies, but this will depend on, in our view, what the different levels are, what you're making decisions on. For instance, the lower the risk of a decision that you're making, as in the lower level decision in the code, for instance, if it's just a deemed to satisfy provision where you don't necessarily need to exercise that much subjective skill assessment, it's more just a tick box approach. Theoretically, the requirements for your core competencies should be lesser there than that of an assessment panel member that might be making decisions on fairly high risk and much more complex development proposals. So that's not meant to dumb it down for anyone. It's more just about keeping things streamlined so that you can efficiently make decisions and assessments for the level that you need to make them. But at the same time, we can make sure that everyone is on the same playing field at the same level. The second factor in these requirements is obviously professional indemnity insurance, which is definitely, I think, a live topic in a lot of people's minds. I don't necessarily think, again, from our perspective, that what is going to be required from an insurance viewpoint will be different to what is currently required. But at the same time, it is essentially something that will be a criteria for accreditation. So you just have to provide a certificate of currency, that sort of minimum standard of insurance. We do think that in terms of council staff, for instance, in assessment panels or as assessment managers, the mutual liability scheme might be available there. And obviously that's something that it's market driven, so it's not something we can necessarily control. But we also think that it's our prerogative to propose a scheme that is able to be covered by insurance policies that are, reasonably available to you guys. So we do have that in mind. And the third factor is that there are fees, obviously, and we haven't really talked about that much. But ultimately, the fees that you would pay for accreditation, or the fee that you would pay to maintain your accreditation, effectively needs to contribute to the cost of running it, which will, the structure we've explained. There is an accrediting authority, there's an audit body, there's the administrative requirements of processing, and all that needs to be accounted for. But at the same time, we need to make sure that you're not paying 10 sets of fees just to be able to do one thing. So we have thought about how we can balance that out and how we can work with the industry to evenly apportion fees where relevant and not make it so that everybody just has a double whammy fee, effectively. So that's the three key components of what we think should be required in order to give effect to the scheme that we want, or that the Act envisages, so that we can have a workable industry in this framework. So why do we need it? I think this goes without saying. I'll probably go pretty quickly through this because I don't think any of this is a surprise, but we know that this is a pretty massive reform of the planning and development industry. It's changing most, I don't want to say everything is changing because it's not changing absolutely everything, but certainly the fact that we're moving to a different structure of policy, the fact that we're moving to a code as opposed to development plans, there is a huge shift in the way that we are approaching planning assessment and development assessment in this state. So we want to make sure that we are providing a structure that the people that currently work within the industry can transition into as well, so that we can promote the highest standard of professionalism within the planning and development industries. We want to maintain this. We want this to be pretty world class, and we think it is. But at the same time, we have to make it so that it works like that too. So, CPD requirements. Let's go straight into it. We have collated all of the current membership bodies or industry accreditation bodies that exist and looked at what they require for CPD, whether it be units or hours. But ultimately it is expressed generally in units, which can correspond to different time frames, but I think it's a good sort of measuring stick to say unit as opposed to hour or anything like that, because it is more transferable between industries. And we've also looked at the average per year across all of those bodies. The reason why we've averaged it out is because it varies from state to state, obviously across Australia, but it also means that depending on which profession you're looking at, you can see the variance in what the CPD requirement is and what the averages are, so that we can sort of aim in the middle, or to even just below the middle, so that we can make sure that we can maintain a standard of ongoing education that we think is suitable for this state and for what we want to achieve, but at the same time won't be onerous and additionally prohibitive for anyone who's working in the industry. So for that reason, we've found that, there's an average of 25 hours per year or units per year required by these bodies. So that gives you an idea of where we're looking to land, and also keep in mind that we're not looking for a requirement that, for instance, if you're a member of PEER and you have to do 60 units a year, this doesn't mean that you're now going to have to do 85. That's not how it works. The way that we would see it is that whatever you're currently required to do, this would work within it. There's no reason why the units that you already accrue or the CPD that you currently undertake couldn't be recognised by this scheme, as long as it meets the relevant core competencies and the right arrangement of CPD units that we think is required. For what it's worth, we've talked a lot to people in the industry, and we don't think that that's going to be a problem at all. We think that's actually probably everyone's attitude as to the most efficient way to do it. So if you've got any questions about that though, happy to hear them later, or if you're concerned. But essentially here, we've landed on a minimum of 20 CPD units per year. So that's just a bit under the 25. But the idea is that we would have these minimum units of core competency topics in every CPD year. We've looked at it and we've thought that 8 units must be core competency topics specified by the scheme, and that would vary according to, as I said, what level you're at and what type of decision you're making. But at least 1 unit has to be professional responsibility. There's also, potential for another unit to be have to be ethics, or have to be some kind of management of conflict or independent decision making unit. We do think that that's important for anyone who's currently making decisions or who will be making decisions under the Act. At the same time, it's a little bit obvious. Everybody would already be very aware of it. I just think that from our perspective, we just want to formalise it. We want to make it so that everybody is doing the same thing and we know that everyone's meeting the same standards. And again, at the end of the day, we want to recognise units that are required due to professional body CPD requirements within that as well, so that you're not effectively having an additional responsibility on top of what you already have to do. So what do those core competency units look like? We think that they should vary depending on the accreditation level, as I said, and we want them to address what we think are identified gaps in knowledge. Tell us what you think the identified gaps in knowledge are in what you do. We think that the people that know best are the people that are currently doing it and making the decisions on behalf of either a delegation or as private certifiers to submit to a council, or however it happens now under the Development Act, however you perform that function. Ultimately, we are moving to a position where you will be the decision maker as opposed to the person that submits your recommendation. And that means that there is a level of authority that you're getting, but at the same time, we want to make sure that everyone feels like they're capable of making the decision that they're making independently. So here, we've sort of broken it down. As I said, it depends on what type of decision you're making. So on the left-hand side here, we've got effectively what are planning levels, and on the right-hand side, you've got building levels. And these are just things that we've brainstormed as ideal core competencies at different levels. Now, I think there's nothing to prevent an argument that at Land Division accredited professional stage, having 8 core competency units required across 4 topics might be a bit much. Tell us. We ultimately, where that sort of lower risk decision making might not necessarily require as much governance education as you might think, because it's not necessarily about meeting procedure or anything like that, because you're making an assessment yourself independently with an applicant. So they're the sorts of considerations that we keep in mind. This is meant to guide you as to the thought processes that we're having about what core competencies should look like, and tell us what you think. I think definitely though, that design unit at assessment manager level, which is at the higher risk level, is something that we're really keen on. Basically because, once you get up to sort of, just below SCAP level decision making, we think that design is something that we care about, and we've got a government architect, we've got policy that's really directed towards focusing on design quality in the state. So these are the sorts of reasons why we're including the differentiation at different levels. Equally for building levels, this is more about, it's probably a little bit gentler for the building side of things, because they're already using a code. They've already got deemed to satisfy, they've already got performance outcomes, and they're used to assessing on the basis of those provisions. But that doesn't mean that there aren't minimum standards that, again, we want everybody to feel like everyone's capable of making the decision at the level that they're at. I think that's probably all on those examples, but I dare say I genuinely think that everyone's going to have something to say about that in the Q&A bit, but that's fine. We'll get there. So this is about this. The next step is looking at how we describe what is a professional responsibility unit. How do we describe what a design unit is? How do we recognise what constitutes a satisfactory education component that you've undertaken in order for us to recognise it? So the idea here is that it could be in the form of something like a code of conduct quiz, or a presentation or a lecture on what are the standard requirements to act honestly and ethically. It goes without saying that part of this scheme will comprise a code of conduct that all accredited professionals have to abide by. So it might be something that is directed towards that code of conduct, or alternatively something that, there's been plenty of court decisions on proper conduct of decision-making professionals. I'm sure you're all familiar with them. So it could be something structured around those sorts of principles that have been handed down by the court. The point is that it's something that we need to be able to recognise as substantively contributing to a accredited professional's ability to make ethical and independent decisions in accordance with their responsibilities. And there are ways that we have thought of to be able to recognise for instance, if an industry body wants to present a CPD program, they can approach us and say, this is what we'd cover. Do you think that that would meet the requirements? And I don't think there's anything to stop us saying, yes, we pre-approve these CPD things, so that they can then advertise them to the industry and say, come and use our CPD program, so that there's lots of options available for you. You don't have to just come to the accrediting authority at DIPTI to be able to get your CPD units and core competencies ticked off. The whole idea here is that we want it to be accessible to everybody, and not so that you're not terribly restricted with your options for where to go to get these core competencies met. Yes, I think that covers everything on this one. Moving on, I think I've covered that specific education requirements for applicants of certain accreditation levels, but ultimately we do think that recording your CPD is going to be a really important part of this. The approach we've taken is that ultimately everything about the scheme is going to be the onus of meeting the requirements of the scheme, I should say, is going to fall on the accredited professional themselves. It's your individual responsibility to make sure that you're meeting all the requirements, whether that's with the assistance of an industry body that offers that service to you, or whether it's coming straight to us and saying, here's everything I've done. But ultimately, we see a capacity for a members portal to be created through SA Planning, the SA Planning portal, where you can submit your CPD components that you've achieved, and then we then have the audit body function that we would set up to randomly check those and make sure that you're doing what you say you're doing. But it's very similar to the way that you would be undertaking your CPD in your current memberships or your current accreditations anyway, where they are required. And again, just here where it says renew registration, I don't want to confuse everyone. We don't necessarily see the initial accreditation as something that needs to be renewed. The idea is that you'd meet your requirements, you'd get accredited, and then annually you have to meet your CPD requirements and submit those, but that's more of a maintenance of your accreditation as opposed to renewing it. The idea there is that I don't want everyone to think that every 12 months you're going to have to resubmit and reapply and repay and go through the entire rigmarole every 12 months just to be able to do your job. The idea is that you meet the requirements and then you just maintain that by making sure that and essentially it could be as small as demonstrating that you've met CPD requirements and showing that you've still got a certificate of currency of insurance that's valid for what needs to be done. It shouldn't be more onerous than that, in the sense that it shouldn't be something that prevents you from efficiently doing your job. We're already aware that you probably have requirements annually or requirements biannually to meet membership requirements, meet accreditation requirements that you're already undertaking. This is an additional accreditation that we're asking for, so we don't want to make it so that you spend your entire year doing administrative tasks. Ideally, you'd be doing the work that you want to be doing. So, keeping the system honest. This is sort of moving aside from the education and CPD requirements. Here we're looking at how are we facilitating that structure. We know what we've just presented on what the structure will be, that each professional will be expected to abide. But then we have the other functions in place to cross-check and reference and make sure that everything is being done the way that it should be. Firstly, we would want an independent auditing body to be set up, or at least tasked with the administrative auditing of these criteria, and also the technical auditing of accredited professionals in decision making. I think that part of that should also comprise and query whether it should be the auditing body or whether you think it should be an accrediting authority that should do this. But ultimately we do have a transition period between what is now and what will be, and everyone's going to have to get into the new scheme somehow. We know that that will take some time, but we also need to account for 98% is going to be fairly easily transitioned because everybody already meets most of the requirements that we've talked about, and the grey area is where you might not. But that 2% left over is going to need someone to assess those and with an objective and professional mind, look at what you're submitting and whether it be 30 years worth of experience on particular projects. Looking at those and saying, yes, you're genuinely entitled to be accredited at level 3 or level 1 of a planning accreditation. But ultimately that work needs to be done, and it needs to be done efficiently so that we can capture the 100% as opposed to leaving off that 2% at the end of the transition period. So at the moment, it could be an auditing body, it could also be the accrediting authority, and it could be as simple as, you know, the chief executive of the department delegating to someone else. It's something that we see as a really important function, but we want to place it correctly so that it can be transitioned efficiently from what currently is to what will be. So again, that's probably something that we're going to ask you to think about a bit later on in today's session. So just keep that in mind. And finally, somebody has to handle complaints, because ultimately we don't have a code of conduct for nothing, and we don't have an accredited professional scheme that allows you to make decisions without making sure that you're doing so consistently. Not that we think that you need to be disciplined, but ultimately we need to be able to deal with discrepancies or deal with questions or concerns being the kind of issues that would currently be the subject of an ERD court appeal. But ultimately they should be handled by an investigating authority, which again could be the auditing body that we appoint. But at the same time, it could be something that already exists that's simply tasked with that job. And if it's an entity that already exists, we'd want to make sure that they know what they're doing. But obviously, under the Act, we're also obliged to say that the disputes handling will ultimately the jurisdiction resides in SACAT. So ultimately, whatever the complaints handling authority is, if it has to be escalated from there, it'll go to the tribunal. So there is this hierarchy that we're dealing with, but we want it to be efficient. So we do want someone to be able to deal with complaints at that first level, so that if it is just someone who's disgruntled or someone who's confused or doesn't really understand the process, we can sort it out. We don't have to necessarily get into a dispute resolution process immediately. I think that sort of covers everything else in terms of the framework. So again, I realise I'm sort of covering a lot of ground, but this is the detail of the scheme. So I guess moving from the education component, I do want to touch on this transition idea. And just explain what we see as that 2% that might not necessarily easily meet the prescribed criteria that we've listed in as ideas in the discussion paper. We did get a lot of feedback on that, and we received a lot of sort of comment that, and you would have heard in the last workshop if you were here, that not everyone fits into, we've got a tertiary degree, we've got 5 years of experience. That, you know, there are a lot of people that work in our industry that didn't necessarily conduct their career in that pathway, but they're nonetheless very, very capable planners or builders or surveyors that can, or allied professionals that can undertake this work very capably, and we don't want to lose them. We don't want them to miss out on being accredited just because we didn't think of that. So ultimately, we've drawn up this very pretty table to sort of give you an idea that ultimately what we would want to see in those 2% is simply an idea that drawing on the core competencies that we see for the level that they're aiming for, they will either have a qualification and certificate in that area. So if you're a planner, for instance, and you've been working for 40 years, you've got a degree. Or you've got the minimum required number of years experience, and you've got a CV or some kind of reference or summary of the work that you've done, so that we can see that if you've been working for 5 years and you've worked on some pretty major complex assessments, or you've worked for 5 years and you've been doing nothing other than land division submissions, so that low risk, but nonetheless you're very experienced at it, there's no reason why we shouldn't be able to recognise that and accredit you on that basis. Equally for allied professions, we see that there could be a qualification requirement, but we also see that there could be some kind of assessment of the core competencies that you might have achieved. And again, that could be conducted by an audit body or some other entity that could, for instance, an industry body that could make submissions on your behalf to effectively cross-check the decisions that you've made and vouch for the fact that you know what you're doing. So ultimately, the idea here is that we're trying to show that there are a few ways that we see that recognition of core competencies or recognition of different types of experience based on the core competencies that we prescribe could be undertaken. So we don't want to make anyone feel like just because you don't fit in the nice pretty category that we've drawn up in a pretty picture doesn't necessarily mean that you can't do what we're proposing. It's all about, as I said, 98% will fit, and the 2% that doesn't fit into those pretty categories should still be able to be recognised. These are just the methods that we're trying to think of to do that.